Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. We have an exceedingly interesting panel, much like all the other panels you've already been hearing. And this one very much looks at Russia from a slightly different perspective, one's own place in the world, quite where it might be going from the point of view of new political generations and new political ideas. Hi there, I'm Mark Galliotti. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. And just give you a brief introduction before introducing the stellar panelists that we have. Certainly, I personally have been struck in my recent trips to Moscow by a certain fin de siècle sense, a certain sense that people know that change is coming, of some sort and at some time. No one quite knows when, no one quite knows what. Some people are enthused and optimistic. More people are nervous and uncertain. It might seem a little strange to talk about a people who sort of know that some kind of change is happening but have no idea what it means. But then again, I do come from the land of Brexit, so it actually seems depressingly familiar. We have a new political generation rising. They may no longer be the generation of Homo Sovieticus, but are they the generation of Homo Putinicus? But of course, Putin is not just the only influence. This is also the generation that is a product of the internet, of post-ideological politics in many ways. The generation of cheap package holidays to Turkey and Egypt, the generation of the smartphone, the generation quite possibly of bank accounts and property in Europe, as we've heard. We're facing the prospect of perhaps one of the most massive intergenerational transfers of wealth that the world has ever seen, as the 1990s generation who stole with both hands are now looking to pass that wealth and the power that comes with it to their own children and descendants. We have the whole question of whether or not Russia is ultimately going to move towards Europe or Asia or continue to spin around in its own little Eurasian bubble. So these are all crucial topics for the future, crucial topics to understand, and I think really important because otherwise we get buried in the minutiae of Putinism. We get buried in the tactical day-to-day of what this particular law case means, what that particular promotion or demotion means. So anyway, to discuss this future, as I said, we have a splendid panel. From the far right, Alexei Levinson is the head of the Center for Sociocultural Research at Levada Center, the best polling outfit in Russia, and is the person, for those of us who like to, as pundits, talk about what Russians think, is the person who actually gives us the data to be able to do that with a half degree of honesty. Then we have Masha Gessen, who's a staff writer for The New Yorker, but more to the point, she's also, someone who has been a very sort of trenchant observer of modern Russia, and the person who gave us the disquieting but impressive image of Putin as the man without a face. Then on my left, first of all, have Ekaterina Schulman, professor at RANEPA, which is this extraordinary named Russian Academy of Sciences. No, you can. Anyway,
National Economy and Public Administration.
Thank you very much.
It's not that hard once you start doing it.
I see. It's just as long as you have the momentum to take you there. But more to the point, from her sort of very, very visible and public profile on Echo Moskvi in every single sort of forum that one could possibly imagine, Ekaterina also gives us a sign that, in fact, one can be a critic of the current regime and many of the forces behind it as a public intellectual still operating in Russia. And then we have Kadri Leak, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Again, a long-time regular of this conference, but also a long-time observer in Russia, and the person who most recently has given us a very important paper about how the notion that Russia is currently in a normative struggle with the West, that is the real battleground. Anyway, we'll start with brief introductions from each of the panelists. I'll ask a few questions, see if I can provoke them into furious rows, and then we will throw it open to questions from the audience. So, Alexei, would you like to start?
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be, for the third time, in this in this hall and near the signature of Leonard Mary. And I keep thinking that Estonia keeps playing a very important role for my country, for Russia. It used to play historically, and I think it will. And this session, although it's devoted to the issues that are important for you guys, it is as well important for us. And I will, since I am labeled as a foreign agent in my country, I will try to convey what I got here to the audience inside Russia. As to the question concerning Russian youth, it's not an easy issue to cover in short introduction, since actually we are thinking about not about the people who are really young at the moment, and so they are not involved into politics, into main social trends and so on. But we are interested in them, as far as I understand the idea, as a future population of Russia and future elites and so on. So we are actually thinking about the Russian people, but not of today, of tomorrow. And it is not easy to talk about the people as a whole, and for a sociologist it is just impossible. But I have to. I think that this generation, though they are not that numerous, Russia is still under the process of depopulation at the moment, and the fertility rate is still rather low. So at the moment, this is the minority in my country. And you know, the fate of minorities is not always a happy one. So the young population in Russia, I think, is under the pressure of the rest of the society, and especially of the elder part of that. The influence of Babushka and her TV set is really an important factor in bringing up of children, not parents, I stress, but grandparents, mainly grandmother. And grandmothers, they belong to maybe partly to Homo Sovieticus, or not, or post-Sovieticus, but they are the ones who experienced the transformation in Russia as something very disadvantageous for them. And they convey this resentment onto their kids. The school that is the realm, the kingdom of not very young babushkas, the teachers, predominantly female, and I'm not a male chauvinist, please don't think this, but they construct again the type of the reality they present to children, that is them as females. They think about one great father or their great, let me say, husband, the state, not necessarily Mr. Putin, but the state as a superego on this community of teachers, and as a result on the kids. Then they get out of school, and mainly they go to the higher education institutions, the quality of which are very different, mainly very low. And there they are, so to say, socially polished and provided with some very general knowledge of everything or of nothing. And then they are on the labor market, which is, it was said in this audience this morning, that there is a kind of a transparent ceiling. They feel that they have actually no advantageous way to go. What kind of professions are the ones that can be treated as staircases or lifts of vertical mobility? Mainly the ones that are linked to the state service, especially the ones that are with epaulets of this or that kind. Yeah, and for a guy in the provincial town, there is no very welcoming way to go into his happy life. So they are a bit frustrated because they did have expectations, partly constructed by the internet and TV. Okay, this is partly the usual case with many countries where the ones who got educated have no decent field of applying their abilities. If you like to know about their affiliations, their political orientations, okay, I dare say that the youngest part of the youth that we are covering with our opinion polls, it starts from 18 years old. They belong to the pro-Putin majority in terms of approval of his performance as a president of Russian Federation. I mean, just this is the formula in the opinion polls. And they are usually more loyal to President Putin, Prime Minister Medvedev, which is rather strange, yeah, and to government and to the parliament, the two institutions that are in they are treated more negatively than positively, but still the positive attitude of the youngest part of the society is the highest. And after becoming 25 years old, they change their attitude. They are much more critical towards the same institutions. I think they understand what's what. Now, about their political, orientations that are not often mentioned. Let me just put it for the discussion that the fundamentalism is what is very attractive for the younger. fundamentalism of secular kind, of Christian Orthodox, and Muslim. This is for the ones who are born Muslims. And also okay, I will stop at this. Yeah. Sorry for being so long.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually question the premise of this panel a little bit, because I think that there's a kind of magical thinking that underlies a lot of the conversations that we've had about Russia for the last generation, which is that there's going to be a new and different generation, right? And that magical thinking, or not that magical thinking, but that hypothesis underlay actually the initial Homo Sovieticus study, right? That study designed by Yuri Levada was, the hypothesis of that study was that there was a generation that had grown up after the terror ended, and that generation didn't have to adapt in the same ways because it didn't grow up under the conditions of terror, and it was going to bring down the Soviet Union because it was no longer that kind of Homo Sovieticus. And that, initially they thought that that's exactly what they showed in the first big study in 1999. And then, I'm sorry, Alexei, I feel very strange talking about the Levada study sitting next to you, but you couldn't cover all of it, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But and gradually, even though the Soviet Union seemed to collapse right on schedule, then all sorts of flaws in that hypothesis started showing up with follow-up studies. And I think that what we've learned over the years is that the legacy of those Soviet adaptations is stronger than all the other factors. And and I love the sort of the Russian discourse about generations. We keep looking for that new generation. There was going to be the generation that was born in the Soviet Union but grew up in Russia, and they were going to be different. And then when they turned out to be a little different, but not that different, after they sort of stepped back after the protests, then there was talk about the very, very new generation that was the face of the new protests. And as we know, that was a bit of a misconception, but there were certainly a lot of very young people who simply hadn't been old enough to participate in protests the last time around. But that idea that sort of the face of the new Russia is barely pubescent, and that will save us, it reflects a kind of generational inflation that ultimately proves that we keep writing off one generation after another. There was a moment in 2017 when that conversation about the very, very new generation began. I remember seeing a Facebook post by Georgy Satarov, who wrote that now we can see that this country has a future because we're seeing the 15-year-olds in the protests. And I remember, Georgy Satarov was a brilliant intellectual, but he, among other things, had been tasked in the mid-1990s with creating a new national idea for Russia. And I thought, how ironic is it to see somebody who tried to get together this working group to create a new national idea, and then they spent weeks at a dacha trying to figure out a new national idea, failed, said, sorry, no national idea. And more than 20 years go by, and he says, okay, finally, the 15-year-olds, this is going to be the new national something. And I think that it's very easy to point at the different experiences of the very new generation, the generation that grew up with the internet, the generation that grew up with the package tours to Turkey and Egypt. But let's be realistic. The internet is just that. It's a place where you don't get answers to questions you don't ask. The package tours are just that. It's a way to travel to another country without traveling to another country. And again, ultimately, I think that if we look at the similarities to the between lived experiences of the news generation and, say, my generation, those similarities are greater than those differences, such as the internet and package tours. And moreover, the similarities are more significant. The experience of the generation is more similar to the experience of, say, my generation that grew up in the 70s than the experience of my generation was to the generation before it. I think in the end, what we're looking at is this passing on of the legacy of the totalitarian experiment from generation to generation, and in some ways, it is being exacerbated by growing up under Putin. It is the experience of growing up with sort of the extreme cynicism in the public sphere that is, I think, even more significant than, again, what my generation grew up with. It's the experience of growing up with a completely hollowed out language, where none of the public language is usable, right? Democracy doesn't mean democracy, freedom doesn't mean freedom, elections don't mean elections, politics means something dirty. It's also the experience of growing up with a completely degraded social sphere, including a really deteriorated education. So I am not holding out a lot of hope for this generation, obviously.
Okay, thank you. Well, Katja, can you bring us a bit more hope?
I would maybe echo some of the things that Masha said, although in a different aspect. We, the social science people, cannot, in all honesty, affirm that there is such a thing as generational values. We should never underestimate the difference of one generation from the other. People are defined by their family, by their immediate environment, by their education, by their place of life, much more than by their year of birth. We should remember that the very names of these very memorable names of generations like baby boomers, like X generation, millennials, and now centennials, or how do they call them, Gen Zers, they are marketing tools. They are not the products of science. So we can't honestly say that there is this entity, one generation. Even the notion of what constitutes a single generation has been rather hazy and changing recently. Originally, a generation were the people born within 20 years of each other. And now, since marketing needs new buyers, we have a new generation almost every 10 years or less. So, having said that, I must say the opposite thing. The experiences, the life-formating experiences encountered by people born within a certain historical period do form their nature, do impress themselves on their souls and influence their behavior. And for Russia, for the last 100 years, this has been more of a truth than for many others more stable societies. Because when you grow up within the limits and constraints of one political system, and then it suddenly breaks apart, and you are in a whole new world, then you kind of remember it. I would also second this idea that we should not look at history and at political processes as on a morality play with a kind of climax and a kind of dramatic conclusion. Political processes and historical processes don't end abruptly, usually. So we can't have those hard lines, both between the generations and between the historical periods. We need them for our own convenience of analysis, but we should not believe in them too much. Demographically speaking, what is Russian society in terms of its generational differences? I would not agree that Russia is in the process of depopulation. But Russia is an old and aging society, which is well within the process of second demographic transition. Second demographic transition is a thing that is happening to every society reaching a certain level of economic development. It constitutes certain things. First, you have higher average life expectancy. You have lower infant and child mortality. You have lower birth rates and higher age of marriage for both genders and higher age of the first birth for females. This is what is called the second demographic transition, and again, it happens to everyone. It has happened in the past decades to almost all the first world countries, and it's now happening to the second and even third world countries also. It has happened in Russia. So we can say that we yet have low birth rates as if it's something that will pass away. It will not. The second demographic transition comes with better life quality, with female education, with female participation in the trade market and in social life, and it can't be rolled back. So we won't have higher birth rates, but we may hope to have higher life expectancy. So the median age of Russian citizen of today is 39. And by the way, she is a woman. An average citizen of Russia. She's a woman living in a city or town, approximately 2 children, lives in an apartment. What else? Her name is Elena Smirnova. That's what statistic tells us. We have currently on the social and political scene approximately, well, roughly speaking, 3 active generations. The so-called grandparents, the children, and the grandchildren. We have the Soviet baby boomers, the generation born in the 50s. It's one of the most numerous chunks of our demographic pyramid. There is a lot of them. By coincidence, they also occupy the higher tiers of Russian administrative pyramid also. They are the people in power now. They are exactly the generation that Mark mentioned as standing under the need to transfer their untold wealth to their children or even to their grandchildren. They are the ones who own property. They are the ones who occupy positions of power. They are the ones who rule federal television, who are the masters of discourse, as the saying is. There's their children, the 40, 35-year-olds, the so-called sandwiched generation, the one sandwiched between, if we're not talking about those in power, but about people in general, they are sandwiched between their parents who need their help and their children who need their care. So they are the most worked out generation, and they are mostly barred from advancing to higher positions, both in business or in politics or in public sphere, because the Soviet baby boomers are there and they are not going to step down. Well, I wouldn't say anytime soon, but they're not going to step down voluntarily. And there are the grandchildren. These may be exactly the young generation that we are trying to discuss, although no figures have been mentioned. But if we take the children of those 40, 45-year-olds, then it will be the people who are 20 or a little younger or a little older. They are the product of the demographic gap of the 90s. They are there's few of them. The one thing that you need to know about Russia's youth is that we don't have a lot of it. This will change a little bit in the next few years, because for various economic reasons, and maybe even thanks to certain efforts on the part of the government, we had exactly 10 years of relatively high birth rates. Not high objectively, but higher than previously and higher than after that. These are the years 2004-2014, which looks like an inscription on a gravestone. So those people who were born within this time frame, when they will become citizens, workers, spouses and parents, and voters, and readers and writers, then this balance of generations will slightly change. So far, we have a few young people. Yeah. This is the data that paints the picture that we presume to analyze.
Thanks very much indeed. Kadri.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm in a way an odd person in that panel because I'm not a sociologist. I don't study these things professionally. But I think my excuse for being here is the research I've been busy with over recent months. And that has to do with the young generation of Russian foreign policymakers. I have been interviewing everyone I could get hold of who might have impact on future Russian foreign policy and who is young. I took a liberal definition of young. I decided that everyone who is younger than me is young. So I have been interviewing people from mid-20s to mid-40s, which actually covers a whole generation. And these have been people working for MFA, Ministry of Economics, Ministry of Transport, government apparatus, academics, experts, journalists, everyone who could be influential except the Silaviki. I didn't knock the door of MOD or FSB because I didn't expect that to lead anywhere. And it has been fascinating experience, though not necessarily optimistic one. My basic takeaway seems to be that we are moving from disappointment to alienation. The older people among my interviewees, they have some disappointment with the West. The younger ones, they have less disappointment, but they have less of that feeling of affinity in general. And that actually, that is a very big thing. If that alienation seriously materializes, and I hear that from older Russians as well, that for the young ones, West is not a partner. Podelnik, one of my older interlocutors, used the word that for older generation, you can quarrel with the West, you can cooperate with the West, but they are your partner. And for the younger ones, it is not so. If that happens, then that will be a big change indeed, because West has been Russia's focal point for centuries. For that same study, I reread Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, hoping to get something about intergenerational conflict, because at school they told us that was the book about. I didn't see that, frankly. What I saw now was both fathers and sons trying to validate themselves through knowledge of West, bringing Western names, mentioning just the sons had fancier Westerners than the fathers. That was it, but it was all about the West. There was no conflict really there. So that would really be a big thing, and in many ways sad. But where would they go? I tried to explore, will Russia turn to Asia or Eurasia or something? No, that was not backed up by any of this. What might be happening is Russia turning onto itself. That's what some people said. We had a row with Europe, we tried to turn to China, no one expects us there either, so we are forced to look into ourselves. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, because looking into itself is something a society needs to do every now and then, and in Russia it might be slightly overdue for many reasons. But still. So what is the disappointment about and like? It is not revanchism of any sort, geopolitical or other, but it is redefinition of Russia-Western relationship. Most of these people who carry those views, they had some expectations that the West somehow will help Russia out of its post-Soviet mess, will give it a hand, drag it out. And now they have decided that actually in the 1990s, the West was advancing its own interests, which didn't coincide with Russia's view of how the world should be. They have internalized it very intelligently. You know, these people are not the ones to blame NATO for expanding, or it's different level of discussion. But even so, that is there, and it goes from mid-40s up until sort of 30-ish people. 30-year-olds told how they went to apply for German visa and had great expectations about relationship with Germany, and then it turned out not the way they expected. But the very young, we did some focus groups with students of MGIMO, final years, master's degree or final years. Alexei conducted it very professionally. I had the pleasure of observing behind the mirror, and their worldview was quite cold. For them, the West was just any other power. They were almost openly hostile about the United States. Germany was viewed a bit more positively. Angela Merkel was often mentioned in positive light as a good foreign leader, but overall it was pretty scary. We asked, whom do you respect from among Soviet or Russian diplomats? And the very young ones were the only ones who massively mentioned Molotov. Older ones mentioned different, and for different reasons, and that's all very interesting. I can go into that later. I've been trying to think, what does that mean for future Russian foreign policy, that young generation is like that? Because, of course, it's not the mentality of the young that will define what future Russian foreign policy will be like. It is different. It's the foreign policy will be set in the Kremlin, and the Kremlin's direction will define which of these youngsters do well and which one will do less well, which one will be in demand, which one will not be in demand. But still, I thought that even if a time comes when there is sort of new demand for better relationship with the West, can these people really conceptualize it? What I could see, or what I fear, is actually a repeat of the experience of 1990s, when Russian liberals were focused on domestic reform. They fought communists a lot, but they failed to articulate a democratic vision of foreign policy. I remember in that same very room once, Yuri Luik blamed Russian liberals for not articulating foreign policy conception of a liberal kind. Boris Nemtsov, or somewhere in the room, stood up and said, well, I was responsible for Gazprom. And that could happen again if you don't have that sort of brain power down there. To finish on an optimistic note, though, they are still very different. I should really be cautious with generalization, because as Katja says, often the individual and family experiences matter more than the overall sort of mood in the society. There are many microgenerations, and that resonated very well with me, because I graduated from high school in 1988, which was a funny year. I graduated under Estonian flag and portrait of Lenin. Before me, there was no flag. After me, there was no Lenin. And I went to university, and I felt that people who were a year older than me and later who were a year younger than me, they were different. We studied journalism. Year older, they was sort of prepared to enter the Soviet journalistic system. The younger ones were sort of proper Western-style reporter types. And of course, it evened out, and I have good friends on both sides, but I still feel that we were different. We were the generation in between. And you have those micro-generations in Russia as well. There are people who have been to Polotnaya, there are people who have not been, there are people who remember Medvedev era, and that is the liberal era for young Russians. That's what passes for liberalism for them. Many would say that, in our time, we had philosophical discussions about the world. After us, it's sort of all very career-oriented, and that's necessarily not a good word. I was surprised to see that 2014 matters. Many people would say that before 2014, I could have gone work for MFA. After 2014, it's impossible. So people are still people, and that's good.
Thank you very much. Let me just, before I throw it open to questions from the floor, just very briefly sort of ask a question of each of you. Alexei, I was really interested by this point you made about how the youngest generation are very supportive of all the institutions and the panoply and the individuals, and even, God bless him, Dmitry Medvedev. But by 25...
No, nobody else does.
Exactly. Someone has to. It's nice to know he has a youth demographic. But by 25, they're much more critical of these institutions and so forth. Do you have any sense of whether this rather more disappointed cohort is conceptualizing of their response in positive terms as we need to do something about it, or in what you might think of as more negative and much more traditional terms is, well, therefore we will isolate us from the body politic. I'll just think about me and my family, and basically the rest of the world can burn.
We know definitely that the turnout of the youngers at the voting polls is lower. For those who are below 25, 52% did not attend the elections when President Putin should be elected. And this is a kind of a paradox, since I said among them the approval rating is the highest, but the attendance is the lowest. And among those questioned, the percentage of those who blamed these elections to be unfair is the highest. So you see, they combine all the attitudes towards the escapism, the criticism, and the loyalty to the supreme power. That's it.
Okay, complex perspective. Masha, and I fully take on board you're sort of much more sort of skeptical about the notion that we will be saved by the barely pubescent Russia. But still, I mean, look, Putin is not exactly like Andropov, much I'm sure he would love to be, let alone Brezhnev or whatever. I mean, obviously, these things actually are much more in geographical time. There is a slight shift, or whatever. I mean, I was wondering, from the point of view, you were talking about this sort of the sort of crippling legacy of the totalitarian experiment. What it is that you think you'd have to see to begin to think, actually, something is changing?
Well, actually, I think we would have to see the opposite of what Alexei has just described, right? Because what he has described, I think, and I'm interpreting it in terms of totalitarianism, but in Arendtian terms, right, what the difference between totalitarianism and tyranny is that tyranny may demand certain behaviors of people, and even the mirroring of certain opinions, but totalitarianism robs them of the very ability to form opinions, right? And the sort of this empty vessel of opinion, of every opinion and no opinion at the same time that Alexei has just described is, I think, a perfect expression of the legacy of totalitarianism, and would have to see that change. And we don't know how that can possibly change. We've never seen this experiment before.
Continuing the joy, Katja, I mean, so maybe then we should think, okay, the very youngest generation, they have vague sense that things are not right, but on the other hand, nor are they willing or able to actually sort of move beyond it and think of change. Let's think of this sandwich generation that you put it, which I felt very, very sorry for as you presented them. You know, they're blocked from on the highest positions. They have the great burden of looking after the generations above and below. Now, naturally, thinking of my own moral bankruptcy, I thought of the gangsters that I look at, where we likewise have an interesting issue of a lack of social mobility. And of course, what is happening is the 30 and 40-year-old gangsters who are thinking, well, where's my place in the sun? They're looking for rather more active ways of ensuring things, as is their way. I mean, should we think of the sandwich generation as essentially politically lost? Or is there scope that they would actually at some point say, no, we are not comfortable with the position we're in?
Far from being politically lost, I personally consider this generation exactly the possible basis for a future change, because we're apt to think about the young, and we're having this panel to talk about the rising generation because we associate the youth with the future and with all the better things, etc. But this is, again, poetical thinking. But should you aspire to political power in Russia, by chance, you should definitely address the 40-year-old. Speaking about generational conflict that has been mentioned by a previous speaker, and Fathers and Sons, a novel by Turgenev, we have a very curious situation here currently in Russia. I described those three generations. Again, we are now stepping into a field of dangerous generalization, but still, very, very generally speaking, the 60 years old tend to have rather strained relations with their children. 60 years old, 40 years old, conflict, misunderstanding, often not on speaking terms, or every family occasion becomes a field of conflict, etc., etc. So here we do have a conflict, maybe not of values, or maybe a conflict of values. But 40 years old, 20 years old, the sociological instruments can't define the presence of a conflict of generations, which is a surprising thing because it was generally thought that it's a must for every generation to rebel against the father, etc., etc. But for those who are 20 years, 25 years old, or, well, 15 to 25, we can't sense the presence of this conflict. They tend to, when interviewed or when they are members of focus groups, they tend to speak very tenderly and respectfully of their parents. And at the same time, parents say that they're proud and happy for their children, which again seems the most natural thing in the world. But parents tend to say, 40, 50 years old parents, we do not know what to teach them. Life is changing so fast. They know better than we do how to live this new life. And 20 years old tend to say, parents don't provide guidance. They don't tell what to do, so we kind of feel afloat. But still, they value each other. And children say that they need and want, and they get their parents' appreciation, etc. This may be counted as part of this family values blossoming, which we currently see in Russia, but I think it's a rather curious thing. So, returning to our 40 years old, whenever there is a reform plan being drafted, more or less secretly in Russia, there's always a question, who may be our support base? Who are the people in power interested in reform, interested in changes? And the usual answer is the deputy ministers, the deputy heads of departments, the second tier, the 40, 45 years olds who know that they won't get any higher, that they are barred from the customary lifts of social mobility. So I don't think that any generation can be called politically lost, and I would also strongly object to this popular idea that somebody born under certain influences cannot live under other conditions, and then you get this quotation about traveling the desert for 40 years until the last person born in Soviet Union dies, etc. This is all rubbish. First, it's inhuman to wait for somebody to die. And second, history doesn't affirm this thesis. People who brought down the Soviet Union were people born in the 20s and in the 30s of the 20th century. And the then 40 years olds who were 40 when the Soviet Union collapsed, they became the most conservative, the revanchist generation. So we should not think that the year of birth is a kind of diagnosis that explains all the political convictions of today and the future political behavior of tomorrow, which are two widely different things, of a person or people or even of a demographic strata.
That's interesting. I mean, certainly, I'm all in favour of any kind of view that sees hope in the future, in the middle-aged. But of course, it's worth noting that if as many people think, Putin himself may be looking for succession. He's unlikely to want to give power to one of the big beasts in his system. In other words, he needs a successor who would actually be relatively dependent. And precisely, it's going to be the deputy ministers. It's going to be the regional governors he'll look to. So maybe this actually gives us, again, I'm looking for reasons for hope. And continuing in this quest, Kadri, you make this very interesting description of the shift from disappointment to alienation. I could argue that's actually quite a good thing. I mean, in many ways, one of the problems of the 1990s was exactly the ridiculously high expectations on both sides, which were inevitably, even if everything had been handled well, which it wasn't, inevitably were going to clash. I mean, one way of talking about alienation is actually precisely to say that these are people who have an unsentimental perspective about the other. And if there is a thought that we might be back in a 1990s scenario, that actually is again a chance for both sides to do rather better at resolving a relationship that is based on the fact that Russia is not Western Europe. Russia will not imminently become Western Europe or necessarily want to become Western Europe. But nonetheless, it is a country in its own rights with its own interests. I mean, am I being ridiculously naive in trying to find some grounds for optimism there?
No, I don't think you are. Actually, I have just written something along these very lines. That book that is being handed out here, edited by Kristi Raik of ICDS, where I try to explain how, indeed, it was the sort of spirit of time in late 80s, early 90s that confused both Russia's and Western thinking about the nature of a relationship and parameters of it. And that's largely why we ended up where we did. So in one way, you are right. But on the other hand, I'm still somehow shaken by these young ones. I think it was certain absence of idealism what did it for me. They had very clear-eyed view of Russia, all its flaws, no illusions whatsoever. They didn't expect in positive change. They said that it's too early for democracy, Putin should rule longer. They were very critical of their opposition-minded peers who go out protesting. They said this is the wrong thing to do. And still they said that with Crimea we showed the West that they must not push us around. So the sort of, I don't know, defending a fairly unpleasant status quo was what they saw as a natural thing, and that I think made it scary. But your general point I do accept. I think lack of illusions, if they really are illusions, is good.
Right, thanks. I must admit that defending an unpleasant status quo is probably the rules of engagement for most foreign ministers. Okay, I mean, I can't be selfish. I want to throw this open now to questions and comments from the audience. I'll take a sort of a batch of a few at the time. Usual rules apply. Wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and please keep it short. Start over there.
Thank you. James Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS. a case can be made that in the early part of this century, Vladimir Putin captured the mood of a new class who could be described as people who were coldly pragmatic, business-orientated and ambitious, nationalistic, resentful about what had happened to Russia in the 1990s, and totally without nostalgia for communism. Disagree with that if you would like, but I have so far in this very interesting conversation, I think with the exception of Kadri, not heard any attempt to characterize the political values of the new generation. And so rather than ask a question, I'm offering an invitation. Could you more concretely speak about, be willing to speak about those, in contrast, particularly in contrast to what we call the Putin generation? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then Ian Bond at front.
Thank you. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. Katerina, you said that Russia is not depopulating, and in a certain sense, it's quite hard to depopulate a country of over 100 million people. But the population has been declining for quite a long time, and structurally, you've got, particularly among males, a continuing crisis of life expectancy. The gap between male and female life expectancy is really quite dramatic. What impact does it have that the cadre of young people is so small and that the cadre of elderly women with no men is so large? Does it have an impact? I mean, do they have a greater impact on the way that the rising generation thinks than anything else that's happening in society?
Thank you. And Konstantin?
Yes, Konstantin Egetz. I'd like to ask the panel to move slightly beyond the academic deliberations and talk about the things that we've seen in the last week in Ekaterinburg, which is quite an interesting, I think, phenomenon. And being a big fan of the city, I'm probably a bit partial. But maybe there is a more sort of practical and socio-political explanation to what we saw and what we are seeing. And another question is to Kadri. Well, I mean, with all due respect, but did you expect any other answers from students of MGIMO being interviewed in MGIMO, probably in rooms that are bugged by not MGIMO but another organization? And MGIMO is essentially the place which redefined conformism, just like Jean-Luc Godard redefined new cinema. What is the takeaway from that? I mean, because these people will relace their boots on the hop the moment it's a President Navalny or a President Khodorkovsky or a President Ivanov.
Thanks. Okay, I'll invite the panel to answer whichever that they want of that. Do you want to start, Alexei?
Yeah. Well, as to the demographic issue that was raised in one of the questions, I tried to speculate a bit on the effect and saying about the babushkas as a factor, an important factor in socializing the kids. The elderly people are depressed, and our governments, starting from perestroika times, they are capitalizing on their resentment. They are feeding them with Soviet films as a kind of very, very precious currency, and paying them for the deficits of Soviet values they were stripped off. And the younger generation, they have picked this up in purely symbolic forms. They didn't ever see anything really Soviet, but they are bearing the T-shirts with the words about USSR and slogans of that time. And the mass celebrations of the Victory Day of the 9th of May is readily accepted by the youth as their feast, adding a very important couple of words that we can repeat it. Thinking about both the victory of the Soviet Union in the World War II and the grasping of Crimea, if necessary. So the Soviet heritage is consumed by these people in both nostalgic form and a kind of a combat spirit added to that. I'm not going to say that they are Homo Sovieticus of new kind. No, they have taken the symbolic layer of that anthropological phenomenon. And about the Yekaterinburg, just a couple of words. I think Yekaterinburg is producing a very, very tiny smell of Maidan. And it, I think, the smell reached Kremlin. And the consequences will follow.
So I will pick up on the Yekaterinburg question, because I think that something different may have happened in Yekaterinburg than what we have seen over the last 2 years of protests. And over the last 2 years, what we have seen is basically Alexei Navalny calling on people at various intervals to come out into the street, and people coming out into the street, which, if you are looking at it through a photo lens, may look like collective action, but actually isn't, right? It is individuals responding to a call that is coming to them through media, coming to them online, and not in any way acting with others in a common space, most important, in a common physical space, right? It's sort of going out and coming home. What happened in Yekaterinburg, just by virtue of this going on over the course of several days, may have been a moment when it becomes converted to collective action, when you actually see different people acting alongside others in the same physical space, having to coordinate and having to interact with people that they don't see on a daily basis. That is a huge, potentially a huge political shift. The way that we have seen the Kremlin respond to those kinds of shifts, or even the threat of those kinds of shifts in the past, is with a crackdown. I don't see any reason to expect anything else, but we'll see.
I will say a few words about the Yekaterinburg affairs, and then maybe about this demographic thing and male life expectancy. Yes, it seems that Yekaterinburg will be a milestone. On one hand, it's an extremely typical event. There is not a city in Russia where similar protests have not taken place. Around a building, a demolition, a park, or a square, or a church, or renovation campaign in Moscow. Everywhere, again, in absolutely every capital of the subject of Russian Federation, and almost in every major city. And quite a few times, these protests have been successful. This is not a popular news item, And this is not widely understood even by protesters themselves. In every next single case, people think they're the first and they're alone. But recently, both due to the growing number of such cases and to the power of social media, people began to connect, well, not exactly to connect, but to know about what is happening in other regions and to take heart from positive examples. So on one hand, Yekaterinburg is typical. On the other hand, there is something new there. It's the fourth largest town, largest city in Russia. It's a city of extremely rich and complex political culture, of a very active political environment. And this is a city that has been unjustly dealt with. They have eliminated the office of elected mayor because a popular figure, Evgeny Roizman, has been elected. First, they stripped the office of all possible power, but even in that form, it posed a threat. So they decided to do it away anyhow. And they have a governor who has been successfully elected in 2019 during what we now see was one of the last possible cases of quiet regional elections. So it was just his luck, but evidently he thought that it was due to some special virtue of his own. The powers, the local, the regional government were doing everything wrong that was possible to do wrong. But again, this is not untypical. What is new is, I would say, I can't exactly say what is new, but there is a sense that there's something new. If they will manage to insist on holding a city referendum on the subject of this building, this will be a new thing unseen before in modern Russia history. Maybe it will all quiet down and the builders, the developers will carry their point. But the scale of the media noise, the amount of attention, and the need for the president to personally interfere, which is very much disliked by the Russian federal political management. This marks this case as something different. I would be cautious yet, but there is a sense of something new around this Yekaterinburg affairs. And about the question of demography and what was, you still remember the question? You are the moderator, right?
Depopulation and the impact of the gender gap.
Yeah. I still deny the depopulation. Depopulation is a different thing from lowering birth rates. What we do have is the great gap, the indecent gap in average life expectancy of males and females. The life expectancy has been growing recently during the last 10, 12, 15 years for both genders, but still the difference is 12 years. Which is a shame. Yes, early male mortality is a curse of Russian society. The causes of this early male mortality are well known and they are all absolutely socially preventable. It's traffic accidents, it's alcoholism, suicides, violent crime, and treatable diseases. About the discrepancy of the sexes, before the age of 25, there are actually more males than females. After the age of 25 comes the balance, and after 40 comes the disbalance. Then after 40, we have more females than males, and the discrepancy grows with every next 5 years. That's what the situation currently is, and again, let me repeat, it's all totally treatable and preventable. It's not some inherent doom, it's not some unbreakable tradition, it's what can be changed by well-known methods applied by a number of countries who have been fighting with crime, with traffic accidents, with AIDS, with tuberculosis, with prison overpopulation, etc. It's all perfectly doable.
About MGIMO, Kostya, I expected something different because MGIMO is big, and I know teachers there who are liberals through and through. Zagorsky, what's wrong with him? Nothing. So I did expect something slightly different, especially given that I expected diplomats to be the hardest group, but I actually managed to have an almost normal conversation with a club of young diplomats in the upper floors of the MFA skyscraper, which was really interesting. And even they managed to display some criticism of certain things that are part of the system, such as, say, Twitter diplomacy, while MFA aggressively engages in it. About political views, though, James, I spoke a little, but there is something you will not like it, but something I feel I need to stress. What hurt me a bit or made me sad was liberal disappointment in the West. And where was that too? Many people who had upheld their liberal views up until these days, they said that they sort of have been disillusioned now because they see that universal Western rules are not universal. Free trade was good until it benefited America. When it didn't anymore, America starts sanctioning China, who has not shot down any airplanes or anything. And that's a direct quote. Or a young guy, still liberal, told me that, these days Westerners, I have a conversation with them, and then they say that, oh yeah, well, I know, you're Russian, what can you say? The sort of dismissive attitude about all things a Russian can say. So I feel I need to stress it to that audience, that Russians are watching us, what we are doing, how we are presenting ourselves, what do we ask, what do we say? And that creates an impression that is sort of amplified beyond to what it seems to be to us. And I think that's actually wise to keep in mind.
I would like to add one thing, and now I'm thinking whether I have ever encountered being dismissed by anyone I talk to in the West. How would it look like? Okay, I've usually been listened to with more attention than I deserve. But concerning the question of the young generation political views, which was asked, we cannot define it in any terms that would be politically viable because, as Alexei has described, it's often a self-contradictory, I wouldn't say system of beliefs, but kind of medley of words and sometimes ready-made phrases that a person repeats. A grown-up person very often, more often than not, doesn't have any system of political views, and young people more than that. But one thing I can say, I may say, possibly, is that certain, and now again we can only be very, very general, this certain leftist trend on the part of the young, I think it is a thing worth mentioning and worth remembering. These values of justice, of fairness, which are the general cry word of Russian society right now, it also has its roots in the hearts of the young. And this naturally leads to what we may call left-wing or left-leaning politics. I wouldn't say they're fans of Marxism. I wouldn't say they're fans of Soviet Union. I agree with Alexei. It's all a meme. It's just a motivator, a picture, words on your T-shirt. It's not serious. But this general idea that there has to be a fair relocation of resources, that state has to help those who need help, that state has vast duties towards its citizens, that inequality is a bad thing. Is it leftist or is it what? Well, it's human. Is it paternalism? I don't know. Isn't this a picture of the young people's beliefs generally? In the United States, in Europe, do we not also hear this demand for justice and this cry against inequality? In this sense, Russian young generation shares these, I don't know if they are values or beliefs or just tastes or longings or whatever, vaguely defined dreams with their coevals around the civilized world.
Thanks. We have 12 minutes left, so we have got 3 questions already sort of stacked up. I would ask questioners and indeed panelists to be very brief. Start, gentleman in the front here.
Thank you very much. The Soviet Union was, or at least pretended to be, highly egalitarian in its values. It would be very interesting to learn your views on what are the values of the youth of today, and how do people, young people, react to the fact that the old values have more or less been abandoned, and they are in the process of accepting their own set of values.
Thank you. And gentleman next to you. No.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexander Solovyov. I'm representing Open Russia here. I just wanted to ask about the indifference. I always hear the accusations that the new generations are indifferent to everything, literally everything, politics especially. But I cannot agree with that because, for instance, well, I do have a lot of colleagues who are not indifferent. They do care about the future of our country. For instance, my colleague Anastasia Shevchenko, she's now under house arrest just for saying truth. She's officially under house arrest for undesirable political activity. And still, her colleagues keep telling the truth in Russia, and she belongs to this new generation. And she lost her daughter when she was under house arrest, and the judges would not let her go to her daughter until it was like, literally the last hour of her daughter's life. And still, despite these horrible actions of Russian authorities against independent political activists, they still exist. And I just wanted to ask, how do you think, does that depend on generation? The indifference of people, or it's just the problem of propaganda?
Okay, thank you. And lastly, below at the end.
Hello. Kadri, my question is for you. You mentioned in the foreign policy community that a turn away from the West didn't mean a turn to the East. But did you get much of a sense of their attitudes towards Asia? Did they, in fact, disaggregate between different Asians? So you mentioned with the Chinese, that nothing was expected. But do they admire the Chinese? You spoke about sort of leaders, sort of heroes on the Soviet/Russian side. But what are their attitudes to people like Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew or other figures like that? Do they admire them? Have they heard of them?
Okay, thanks very much. What we'll do is we'll do it in reverse order this time, so starting with Kadri. And let me actually just tack on to Bobo's question. A more general one is, who are the role models of the current generations? Do they have them? Or are they just simply waiting for someone who is different? Kadri.
Yeah, thanks. About China, they take it as a fact of life, that China is becoming a big power. In foreign policy context, they are thinking, what does that mean to Russia and Russia's positioning? In business context, they would say that we can never compete with China on production. We need to find other ways to add value. So it's very pragmatic. The phrase that came through many times was that things are the way they are in all contexts. Role models, though, that is very hard. I ask about the diplomats or foreign policy makers they respect, and the answers were not exactly enthusiastic. And often what they respected were the sort of technical skills as opposed to set of values or worldview. Someone said that Churkin was a really good diplomat because he had visited him and he had been lamenting about Russian foreign policy. Why we are a big country? Why is our foreign policy about Luhansk and these night wolves? What on earth is it? And then he put on a suit and went on to defend that very same country at the UN. So, that sort of thing. Role models whom to emulate in the sort of true sense, I I need to go through my notes once again, but there weren't very many. No.
Yeah, gotcha. So we had, yes, egalitarianism, values of the youth today, the question of indifference, and of course Asia.
I naturally can't comment about attitudes towards Asia, but I need to add one point to what Kadri said about continuing from disappointment against the West to alienation from the West. Let us still keep in mind that Russia is a European country, a country of European culture, that European means normal in Russian language, and Asiatic is a denegatory term, sorry for being politically incorrect. And let me also remind you of the thing that happened in the summer of 2019, and I mean the football championship, and not just the euphoria during the football championship, but the change of attitudes measured by polls. The change happened during the festivity events, but there was no backward trend after the festival, the Carnival of Freedom ended. We had better attitudes towards all the outer actors, United States, European Union, even Ukraine. People began to think better of other countries because during this few weeks of festivities, they were allowed to be themselves, to be free from the duty imposed, the duty of watchfulness and hostility imposed by propaganda. So when changes in Russian foreign policy do come, please do not be surprised at the attitude of the Russian people, because you wouldn't expect these sudden reversals that do happen from time to time. And about egalitarian values, I have tried to describe in answer to the previous question as concretely as I could those kind of left ideas entertained by the young people in Russia. Are these values, are these ideas egalitarian in a strict sense? Well, Russia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Our Gini index is frightening. We do not have the concrete figures. We cannot really say that, what are these lately printed figures? 98% of all property is owned by 3% of population. I don't know where they get these exact numbers, but the idea, the picture is clear enough to anybody. So it's no surprise that people in Russia, and especially young people who have little to lose and everything to aspire to quote Marx, that they would be first and foremost anxious and angry about inequality. I don't think it makes them communists. I don't even think it amounts to any ideology. But this is a fact, and it will not go away. And the great transition of property mentioned by Mark will not help to make this matter less urgent to Russians and to young Russians specifically.
Thank you. Masha.
I actually want to take issue with a couple of things that Katya said earlier. One is I think it's a little cavalier and not exactly accurate to say that the reasons for Russia's excess mortality are well known. In fact, what we know is that some of it can be explained, but most of it actually cannot be explained, or at least half of it cannot be explained, because if you adjust for different factors, if you adjust for substance abuse, you will see, countries with similar levels of substance abuse having much lower excess mortality. If you adjust for the environment, if you adjust for poor diet, basically whatever you adjust for, you're still ending up with a lot of more dead people, especially a lot more dead men, than you would expect. And there are a couple, I think, of very interesting hypotheses about this. One of which is depression, is that it's a population of people who are depressed, and depressed people have excess mortality. Illness results in more death when people are depressed. I think that's a very interesting and important hypothesis. Another is that high-risk behavior is not so much caused by substance abuse as it is actually a rational response to a life in which somebody is completely has no agency. And I think that is an easy transition for me to apathy, where apathy is also a rational response. It is a rational response to a lifetime of knowing that your vote doesn't matter, your opinion doesn't matter if you're so lucky as to have one, your right to protest is contested, action carries with it extremely high risk and almost no reward. And so apathy is a rational response to those kinds of conditions. And in that sense, I think that you're right to draw attention to the very small minority of people who are not apathetic. That is an extraordinary occurrence, and it is worth paying attention to. And one last thing, because we're almost out of time, I also want to take issue with this idea that justice, the privileging of the term justice, signals a kind of left politics on the part of the youth. We don't actually know enough about that. We know that people say justice, and some of them will say that what they mean by justice is redistribution of wealth, and others will say that what they mean by justice is that, look, I'm more able than you are, I'm more capable, so I should have more, and that's justice. And the extreme left position, the extreme libertarian position, is what you get when you have no public conversation. When you have no political sphere, when you have no way to discuss politics, you will have extreme primitive positions, and you can only get nuance. You can only actually have articulated values if you have a public sphere.
One point.
I'm sorry, time
no.
is... Unfortunately, you'll have to have that together afterwards over dinner. Alexei.
I would say a couple of words about the role model for the young, and I think I'm afraid to formulate this in this audience, but I will. President Putin is, but not as an example of extreme success or strength or whatever. And this is a very marginal influence of his. But the discourse he made official instead of being unofficial in traditional Russian culture. The cynicism, the ability to lie looking at the personal eyes, which is no news at all in the humanity, but it is always treated as something belonging to the, so to say, the dark side of the life and of behavior and so on. But once it is made a kind of thing you can be proud of, this is, and to my mind, this is a great damage to the public morale, and it has been done.
Look, we could clearly spend another 90 minutes easily sort of dissecting this further, but alas, our time is up, and more to the point, we're keeping you all from your dinner. I think the message that comes out of this is complexity, that we should not assume that a younger Russia is necessarily a friendlier Russia, but nor should we necessarily assume that everyone is completely a product of their times or some kind of teleological shift. They watch us, we watch them. There is an inevitable interaction, but change of some kind may be coming, but we'll have to see what it is. But for the moment, I'd like to thank you all for attending, for your questions and so forth, and more to the point, I'd like to thank the panel for their very illuminating talks.